Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Story of Sarah, an Amish Romance by Grace Given. Chapter 1, Hard Questions. Abram ran a hand over the chestnut mare before slapping her rump to send her off into the pasture. He watched the horse gallop away, her foal not far behind. The sight made his heart clench in regret. New life was beautiful and precious. But he was beginning to think he and his wife Sarah would never know what it was like to hold their own child in their arms. Herr, Gott, why? Have we displeased you somehow? He knew it wasn't his place to question the Lord, and yet sometimes in his weakness he did. Abram pushed back from the fence and walked up the hill toward the house. His straw hat kept him in shade, but the day was hot and humid, and he felt perspiration trickle down his neck. Above him, storm clouds gathered. There would be a storm tonight, that he was certain of. The cool of the house greeted him, and his heart warmed with pride in his wife, as he saw her standing over the stove, rows of bright vegetables filling glass jars. Kenning? Yeah, she replied, turning toward him. I am nearly done. You've been busy. He admired her strength and stamina. The hard work she put into keeping their home clean and comfortable never went unnoticed. We'll be getting a storm tonight, he warned her. I must get the washing then, she said, with a hand flying to her chest. You have time. He walked over to her and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. They had been married 28 years, and he still loved her more every day. God had truly blessed him, that he was sure of... What was that for? Sarah asked, smiling. No reason, just thankful, Liebchen. Denki, I, too, am thankful for you. She turned back to the stove for a moment before saying, but as thankful as I am, I do not want to need to wash your clothes again. I will be back. He smiled, watching her go out to take down the wash in haste, the clouds growing darker by the second. Abram was struck by the fact that he and Sarah had weathered many storms, just like the one that was coming. They blasted in quickly, drenched everything in sight, and cleared up almost as suddenly as they had come. It seemed life could be like that, busy and full of excitement, like when they had first married, only to slip away into the comfortable life they now lived. The question was, just like this storm that was coming, did God have another storm in their future? Sarah worked quickly, her hands skilled at unpinning the clothes, folding them, and placing them in the basket at her feet. She worked in a rhythm, humming a hymn softly to herself. She was thankful Abram had pointed out the coming storm, or she might not have gotten the wash down in time. Her brow creased. Abram had seemed sad somehow. He was always a quiet man, never saying more than needed to be said, but she had almost felt as if he were preoccupied. She heard the door to the house close and watched as he walked down the hill back to the barn. He'd likely need to bring the horses back into the barn, though she'd seen him setting them out to pasture only a little while before. In fact, she'd caught him looking at the colt and its mother. It felt like a fist clenched at her heart, and she gasped out loud. The pain came back sometimes, the memories unbalancing her and claiming her attention for the moment. Just as they did now, they clouded her mind and threatened to engulf her. She prayed devoting her attention to the words she was whispering quietly instead of the guilt-filled regrets. They were in the past. They were in the past. They had no bearing on today. But they did. She stifled a sob, checking the pasture to see if Abram was coming back to the house. He wasn't in sight, and she quickly took the wash inside, craving the safety of their room to cry her tears. They came rapidly, like the rain that would soon be falling. It was easy to tell herself that she wasn't to blame, that God had simply not blessed them with a child because it was not in His will for them, but the evil truth raised its head, daring her to try and ignore it. She wiped her tears, focusing on putting the folded laundry away, but the thoughts wouldn't leave. She knew that Abram wanted a child as much, if not more, than she did. He had always desired to be a father, and she had not been able to give that to him. The feeling of guilt increased. She should have told him about what happened during her Rumspringer years ago, likely when they first got married, maybe even before. But the years had passed, and she had prayed that they would find themselves with child. It hadn't happened. The first crack of thunder rumbled in the distance, warning them of the impending threat of rain. Their animals would be startled, and it would take Abram additional time before he came in from bedding them down for the storm. She should make him one of his favorite meals. Smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, she stood and wiped beneath her eyes. The tears came away, but she wondered if he would notice the sadness remaining in her eyes. He always seemed to know when she was unhappy. Sending up yet another prayer, Sarah made her way downstairs to begin the evening meal. If she focused on the task at hand, the past was less likely to rise up and trap her again. Chapter 2. A Surprise Delivery. The sunlight was almost gone, and the battery-powered lamp on the side table sent gentle shadows through the living room. Abram had come in from tending to the animals, soaked and tired, hungry as well, and Sarah had happily served him his favorite meal with a smile. She felt the sting of her slight deception, though. It wasn't that she had tried to conceal things from him, but the past continued to tap her on the shoulder. Should she tell him? They sat in the sitting room, the dimming light coaxing yawns from them both. Sarah looked up over the needlepoint she was working on. To see Abram with his eyes closed, she smiled, knowing he would pretend to be awake and just thinking if she asked, but she didn't want to disturb him. Another loud crack of thunder rattled the windows, and Abram sat straight up, eyes wide. Sounds like God is walking around in the heavens. Or running, Sarah said with a smile. Yeah, Abram pushed forward in the chair, a deep yawn escaping his lips. Yeah, Liebchen, we need our rest if we can get it. Her eyebrows rose as the rolling thunder rocked the house again. They readied for bed, but just as Sarah was about to slip under the covers, Abram came to stand in front of her, taking her hands in his. I know you've tried to hide it from me, he began. Her heart raced. Did he know her secret? How had he found out? Her palms grew moist beneath his touch, and she swallowed, unsure of what he would say next. But I can see past your smile, Lieb. He squeezed her fingers for emphasis. What is troubling you? Sarah resisted the urge to let out a deep sigh, realizing he had only noticed her unhappiness. Her secret would remain hidden. For now, I ache for a child, Abram. She chose the truth, this time. I know you do as well, and I can't help thinking it's my fault. Her voice broke, the emotion too great to bear. Abram squeezed her hands, then let go, opting to place an arm around her instead, drawing her close. He kissed the top of her head where the gray hair was starting to become more pronounced, adding even more weight to the fact that a child at her age was unlikely. While a bobbly is something that I want, it is not the thing my happiness rests on, nor is it within our power to do anything about. He looked down at her, lifting her hand to kiss the knuckles. You could no more hang stars in the sky than be at fault for our lack of a child, Leibchen. Please remember that. Herr Gott is in control. What he wills is always best. His words at once shamed her and encouraged her, their power over her emotions just as bittersweet. Abram was so kind and understanding. She didn't deserve a husband like him, and yet God had seen fit to bring them together. Once, long ago, when they were courting, Abram had insisted that he didn't need to know her past, but his words now nearly dragged the truth from her. Another bolt of lightning lit the sky, and the responding thunder followed soon after. "Do you believe me? Do you hear my truth?" he asked, leaning closer to her. "I do, man. It is just troubling, a joy I have prayed for, and for so long." "I know," Abram said, drawing her into the warm embrace of his arms. "Herr Gott hears our prayers. He will be faithful. I believe it." Abram felt the weight of the dream pulling him downward. He ran through the forest, searching after. What was it? Up ahead it looked like a baby deer. It limped painfully as if it had hurt its leg. He knew instinctively that he needed to help it, but he didn't know how he would catch it. Run, he thought. The wind and the rain plastered his face, hindering him. He couldn't quite reach the fawn, but he was gaining on it. In the distance, he heard it crying. Its screams shattered the night and mingled with the pounding of the rain. Strange, he thought. It sounded like a baby, not a fawn. He tripped, falling forward over a log and slamming into the ground. Abram jolted upright in bed, his heart pounding. Where was he? He tried to ground himself in reality, looking around as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He was in bed, in his home. His wife was asleep next to him, and he just had a dream. That was all it was. And yet, he still heard the cries of the baby. Sarah stirred, no doubt awakened by his sudden movement. She rolled over and reached out a hand to his shoulder. "What is it, Abram?" He blinked several times, still shaking fragments of the dream off. It had seemed so real. A dream, that is all. She sat up and he vaguely saw her run a hand over her hair. But then she stilled, turning toward him. "Do you hear that?" "What do you hear?" he asked, needing to know he wasn't the only one who heard the cries. "It sounds like a bobbly. Have I lost my mind?" "No, I hear it too." He jumped from the bed, pulling on his trousers and tucking his nightshirt in haphazardly. He heard Sarah getting out of bed as well, but he rushed from the room, taken by the same urgency he had felt in his dream. He had not been able to help the fawn, but maybe he could help this child. Throwing open the back door to their porch, he looked right then left, halting his movement when he saw it. A dark shape covered by a blanket barely visible in the light of the headlamp he'd hastily grabbed as he left the house. He took cautious steps toward it, noticing the detail of blue ducks on the quilt that covered the shape. It was easy to tell that the cries were coming from under the blanket, but something caused him caution. A warning almost. How had this gotten here? "What is it, Abram? What have?" Her words halted when she saw the blanket-covered shape. "Don't just stand there," she said, moving forward. Before he could warn her that it could be dangerous, though he didn't know how a baby could be dangerous. She had pulled back the quilt to reveal the bright pink, scrunched-up face of an infant. His heart leapt into his throat at the sight. The poor child's tiny fists were clenched as its little lungs shattered the night with cries. The rain still pelted the roof, but the thunder had subsided. Now the only sound was the baby. "Oh my," Sarah said. The poor thing's nearly soaked through. She reached out to pick up the child, but Abram spoke up. "Wait." Her hands stilled inches from the child, and she turned to look at him. I'm not sure." He fumbled for words. Warning bells went off in his mind. This was not their child. Someone had left it here, but why? Was there something wrong with it? Though when he looked down at the little one, his chest filled with warmth because the baby looked absolutely perfect. "Abram," Sarah said, drawing him back from his thoughts, "I need to comfort the child." He nodded once, and she turned back to the baby, reaching into the carrier it had come in and drawing it to herself. Again, his heart constricted. That was a sight he had longed to see since they had first married, Sarah holding a child. Though he had desired for it to be their baby, was this God's way of giving them a child? Sarah cradled the wee babe to her chest, every motherly instinct suddenly alive and quivering inside of her. Where had the baby come from? Who had the baby come from? Who had left it on their porch? Why their porch? The wind picked up, and rain splashed onto the porch, the baby crying out as his little face was pelted with cold rain. She didn't know how, but she knew it was a boy. "We need to get him inside," she said, looking toward her husband. Abram stood staring at them both. He was shocked. This much she could see, but he came to action quickly, holding the door open for her. Inside, he turned on a battery-powered lamp they kept in the kitchen and moved to find their other battery lantern. She turned her attention to the child, rubbing soft circles on his back and whispering quieting notions into his perfect little ear. From Abram's headlamp, she had been able to see the child clearly for a few seconds, the image emblazoned on her memory. Where had he come from, this perfect little child left in the middle of the night? Her thoughts jumped to conclusions faster than she could have imagined. Had God caused the mother to leave the child with them? Was it his way of answering their prayers? Abram came back into the room, the light from the second lamp creating an additional soft glow. The child was calm now, his wide eyes open and observing Abram's movements. "We need to find him something to wear. His clothes are soaked through." Abram nodded. It seemed the situation had stolen his words. "Will you hold him while I get something?" Sarah looked up into the wide, startled eyes of her husband. They mirrored those of the child, and if it hadn't been for the situation, she would have laughed. "He will not bite you." Abram glanced at her before reaching his hands out for the baby who, surprisingly, settled comfortably against him. Sarah felt the pressure of tears in her eyes and turned away quickly before Abram could see, running up the steps to get cloths to swaddle the little one in. The picture of her husband standing there holding a child was almost too much to bear. It was a beautiful picture, one she'd imagined so many times, and yet it wasn't perfect because this was not their child. Sarah's hand stilled on the door to the linen closet. But it could be. He could be their child. She flushed, realizing that it wasn't that simple. They would need to talk to the council, especially seeing as how the child had come in an Englisher's carrier. Questions would be asked. The mother would need to be found. Sarah's heart sank a little. Selfishly, she didn't want the mother to be found, but she immediately prayed for forgiveness for her thoughts. Of course, she'd rather have the child with his mother, but if the mother was unfit... She yanked the door open and grabbed a handful of cloths and towels, forcing the thoughts from her mind. It was foolish to think this way. All that mattered now was taking care of the child and then doing whatever Abram would decide. Peace settled in her heart. Abram was a man who loved the Lord. He no doubt would know the best thing to do. Chapter 3, Heart's Desire. Abram's eyelids refused to open, but he forced them to obey his will and sat up, the early morning sun just peeking over the gentle hill behind their home. They had hardly gotten sleep last night, after taking care of the child. Sarah had warmed up milk and fed the babe who had instantly fallen asleep until he woke again, 2 hours later. It had gone on like that through the night. Careful not to waken Sarah, Abram dressed and checked on the baby. He lay amidst blankets and pillows surrounding him on the floor of their second bedroom, the room that had always been reserved for a child of their own. He pressed his lips together, seeing the little one fast asleep with his arm resting above his head. His cheeks were plump, but nowhere near as chubby as most healthy babies Abram had seen. His little stomach also looked too lean. "Where have you come from, son?" He whispered the question to the quiet of the room, then stepped back, partially closing the door before he headed downstairs. Chores and work could not be put on hold, but what would he say? What should they do? Puffy clouds speckled the sky, stretching out as far as he could see. They didn't hold the promise of more rain, though, something Abram was thankful for. They could use the time in between storms for the land to soak up the large amount of rain left behind before the next storm came. After feeding the animals and readying the buggy to leave for work, Abram made his way back to the house. Sarah stood in the kitchen, the smell of eggs making his stomach growl in response. "Morning, Liebchen." He kissed her on the cheek and noticed the dark circles from lack of sleep. He squeezed her arm in a reassuring gesture. "How is the little Bobbly?" "Still sleeping," she said, the tired smile on her face one of satisfaction. "I believe he will rest for another hour or so." Abram was amazed at what a wonderful mother Sarah already was, though he mentally chided himself for thinking of her as a mother. It wasn't right. Not yet, at least. "Abram, what will we do?" The concern in her eyes was evident, and he knew instantly that she was worried about what would become of the baby. Of course, she was. She had a tender heart, especially where children were concerned. "I've been thinking on this all morning," he admitted. He looked at the window, asking the Lord again for confirmation that what he was feeling was the right thing. "And what have you decided?" He took in a deep breath, then let it out as his eyes came to rest on his wife's light brown ones, the eyes he'd first looked into so many years ago, knowing that he wanted to marry her. She had been burdened then, weighed down by her past, but he'd told her not to bring that with her into their new relationship. That the Lord was a God of the present and the future. He still believed that today, but he was thinking more about the future than the present in this moment. "I want nothing more than to take him in, Sarah. To give him a home and treat him as our own. But I also realize it is not just our decision. It must be brought before the council. The boy's mother must be sought out, and then after all of that is decided, we can begin to think about future plans." She looked crestfallen, but nodded. "I had thought as much." Abram wanted to reassure her, but he wasn't sure what he could promise her. "I will talk with them today. I will explain what happened and see what they advise. For now, treat him with love, which I know you will. But try not to attach yourself too much to him." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I'm afraid I've already done that." "To the best of your ability, try and keep in mind that we may not have him for much longer." "I know," she said, nodding and trying to keep the tears in her eyes from falling. He pulled her into his embrace, lightly kissing her forehead. Herr Gott hears our cries. He will answer them. Even as he reassured his wife, he reassured himself with the truth, though part of him still desired this to be God's answer to their many prayers for a son. Sarah hummed as she changed the little boy's diaper she had made of cloth. She would have much washing to do, but she didn't mind. Part of her pleaded with the Lord almost every minute that they would be able to keep him, and at the same time, she tried hard to obey her husband's request to not become too attached. Looking down at the little one, his feathery red hair flying in all directions, while he smiled up at her, she knew her heart was lost to him already. "You are strong, little one," she said to him, lifting him up into her arms. He smelled like powder and springtime, mingled with that special scent babies had. He had eaten a hearty breakfast of goat's milk, and despite his cries during the night, he had hardly uttered a sound this morning. She was coming down the stairs when she heard a knock on the door. Immediately, her heart thudded in her chest, and she clutched the baby closer to her. Was it the mother? Had she come to reclaim her baby? What kind of mother would leave a child outside in a storm like the one they had experienced the night before? Sarah calmed her harried thoughts and went to the door, happy and relieved to see it was her neighbor. "Ruth, come in." Ruth's eyes widened at the baby in Sarah's arms. "What do you have there? Or should I say, who?" Ruth was one of Sarah's closest friends, and without hesitation, Sarah shared the story of finding the baby and about their decision to have Abram speak with the council today. "That's wise," she agreed. "But I can't help but think." She trailed off, but Sarah thought she knew what her friend was thinking. "So it's not just me that sees what this could be." "No," Ruth said, her eyes captivated by the little boy. "My friend, you have been so faithful, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was God's way of providing a child for you." Sarah's heart leapt in response. "I have hoped and prayed as much since he showed up at our door." The women talked, and Ruth occupied the baby while Sarah started dinner. When it was time for her friend to leave, Sarah gripped her tightly in a hug. "Thank you, my friend." "I will pray for her God's will," Ruth said, leaning back to look at Sarah, "but know that my desire is for this baby to be yours. I will most certainly let him know that." Sarah laughed, the sound coming out freely and feeling like a breath of fresh air. She had been praying the same thing and would continue to, no matter what, though she had already given a piece of her heart away to the sweet child in her arms. Chapter 4. Isaiah. Abram opened the shop door, breathing in the scent of wood that had become second nature to him. He had learned the art of woodworking from his father, who had learned it from his father, and so on. The craft was passed down through the generations and filled Abram with a sense of purpose and accomplishment when he looked around his small shop. It was filled with furniture and smaller items that Englisher tourists often picked up by the dozen to take home with them. He was happy to provide things that caused joy in others. At the same time, it caused joy in him. He smiled, knowing that only the Lord could orchestrate something like that. His mind flew to the boy. Only the Lord could orchestrate something like that as well. Abram's meeting was that afternoon, and he would bring up his situation to the other members of the council. His nerves zinged, wondering what they would say, but ultimately, he trusted their wisdom and that they would seek the Lord in this. What they decided would be best. Yet, he still prayed for the outcome he wanted. The Lord said to knock and to ask, sometimes repeatedly, for what you wanted, and Abram was doing just that. The door opened and Samuel walked in. He was still young, but close to going on his rumspringer. Abram would miss the boy's help in the shop, but knew it was an important time in a youth's life. "Gooder morning, Samuel. How are you?" "I'm good," Samuel said, tugging off his coat and hat. "And you, sir?" "Good as well, my boy." They spent the morning restocking the front of the store from a shipment of goods he'd received from his brothers, who often provided additional stock when Abram couldn't keep up with the demands. One day, Abram said, as Samuel helped him move a rocking chair into a new location, "Maybe I could teach you some of the trade. That is, if you'd like." Samuel had worked for Abram for a few years now, and Abram had taken him under his wing. He saw the desire in Samuel to learn and hoped that the boy would be baptized into the faith and come back to work for him after his rumspringer. "I'd like that," Samuel said. He looked genuinely happy, which made Abram glad. A horn honked outside, and they both turned to look. Recognizing the car, he glanced down at the boy. Samuel's cheeks flushed, and he mumbled, "Sorry, I'll be right back." Abram watched as the boy went out to talk with his friend. Abram couldn't remember the name of the young man, but he knew he was currently enjoying worldly pleasures, like his car, during his own rumspringer. The boy had been a troublemaker before, but now it seemed he could have an effect on Samuel. "Protect him, Gott?" Abram asked, observing them from behind the counter in the store. Movement in the car drew Abram's attention. It looked to be a girl in the front seat next to the troublemaker. With a start, Abram realized she was staring back at him. Her red hair framed her face, but she wasn't smiling or even talking with the boys as they laughed. She just watched him and then quickly turned away when she saw him looking back. It unsettled Abram, but by then Samuel was coming back inside, and the other boy drove off in a peal of tires. "Sorry about that," Samuel said. He looked genuinely sorry, though Abram knew he was friends with the boy. Abram wanted to say something to him, to caution him. But his eyes lit on the clock. If he didn't leave now, he would be late for his meeting with the council. "It's all right," he said, taking up his coat and hat. "I'm going to a meeting. Will you lock the door behind me and turn the sign to closed? When you're finished with the rest of the inventory, you're free to go." Samuel beamed with the extra responsibility, and Abram hoped he was doing the right thing to encourage the boy. Rather than doubt his instincts, though, he nodded and left. Samuel would need to learn how to choose the right path. That was something Abram couldn't do for him. Sarah walked around the house, jostling the baby up and down. She let out a sigh, resting her cheek against his head. It was warm and the hair tickled her, but she didn't mind at all. The wind blew in from the open window, and, on an impulse, she pushed her way out of the back screen door onto the porch. The air was still hot and humid, but it was refreshing nonetheless. She'd been inside all day, and the air had become stuffy from her early preparation of dinner. She hummed a hymn tune, rocking the baby back and forth. He relaxed in her arms, and she knew he was asleep, but she couldn't bear the thought of putting him down again. It was likely that Abram was meeting with the council now, or he already had, and she couldn't imagine missing out on this moment with the boy. She didn't know how many more moments she would get. A sound drew her attention to the side of the house, and she spun around, wondering what it was she'd heard. Birds flew into the air, startling her. Hesitantly, she stepped to the side of the porch and peered around. There, in the distance behind hedges that lined their property, she thought she saw someone or something run behind the thickest of bushes. Her heart hammered, and she clutched the baby close. She couldn't be sure, but it had looked like a girl with red hair. The thought of losing the little boy overtook Sarah again, and she begged and pleaded with the Lord to hear her cry. Would he hear her cry? Would he grant her only prayer? A prayer for a child? She clutched the boy to her chest and went back inside, needing the comfort of being hidden from prying eyes. She had likely imagined the whole thing anyway. The stress and lack of sleep had likely taken its toll on her. Sitting down in her rocking chair, she closed her eyes, hands wrapped protectively around the child. The sound of the door closing jolted Sarah awake. Abram stood in the doorway, his hair matted where the brim of his hat had pressed it down. He wore a faint smile, and she immediately got to her feet, happy to see that she hadn't woken the child. "You're home," she said. It was an obvious statement, but she could barely stand the tension, wondering what the council had said. "Yeah," Abram said, dropping his hat on the table and coming toward her. "And I have news." She could barely stand it, but she waited patiently for him to speak. When he stood in front of her, his clear blue eyes pouring into hers, she saw the smile grow. "The council has said we may keep the child." In truth, Sarah began to shake all over, hardly believing her husband's words. "In truth, minor Freya. He is ours, though we must seek out his mother if she may be found." "Of course," Sarah said, trying not to think of the girl she thought she'd seen. As if the mere thought would be conveyed on her features. "But there is only one problem." Sarah sucked in a breath. What could it be? Yeah. Abram stepped close to her, resting a hand lightly on the boy's back. The look of love in his eyes filled Sarah like a cup overflowing with water. He already loved this little boy more deeply than she would have imagined. She felt the same love in her own heart. "The only problem," he said again with a smile, "is that he needs a name." Tears trailed down Sarah's cheeks, her happiness almost tangible. "Isaiah," she finally said, trying to keep her voice calm so as not to disturb the resting babe. Abram nodded. "I think it is a fitting name, what with all that red hair." She smiled up at her husband, now a father. God had answered their prayers, and all she could think to do was thank him for the incredible gift of their son. Of Isaiah, chapter 5, Restlessly Waiting. It had been a week, and Abram felt the strain of interrupted nights. Sarah tended to the boy almost constantly, but Abram knew she needed rest as well. Last night he had come and taken the child from her so she could get a little sleep, even if only a few hours, knowing that she would be home with the child all day while he was at work. The baby was by no means an overly fussy child, but he and Sarah were no longer in their young years, and he could see they both felt the strain. Yet how could they complain? How could they complain? It was the answer to their prayers for as long as they had been married. That God had gifted them with a child, amazing, if not a true miracle. And yet, in the early morning hours, Abram had wondered at the reality of it. Was there a mother somewhere missing her child right now? Did she feel the loss, or was she simply happy to be rid of the boy? That thought hurt Abram, an almost physical pain. He had only taken charge of the boy for a week now, but he already felt a great love toward him. He looked down at the block of wood in his hands. He always carved when he had problems to think through. Today was no different. The shop was quiet. Samuel was out dusting throughout the shop, which afforded Abram time to sit and think, his hands moving over the wood in practiced motions. The sound of a car pulling up out front drew his attention. It was the boy again, Jacob. Abram had finally remembered his name, and it looked like the same girl was with him. They exited the car and came into the shop. Jacob merely shot Abram a look as he walked towards Samuel on other side of the shop, But the girl, her wide blue eyes bright on his, seemed to take in every inch of Abram before turning away. Rather than follow the boy Jacob, she trailed her fingers over some of the wooden furniture, stopping to look at the toys Abram carved for little children, small trucks with rolling wheels, animals, yo's, and other sorts of children's toys. Her shoulders drooped, and he couldn't help but think she carried a great burden. Placing the small horse on the counter, he stood and came to stand next to her. "Can I help you find something?" She jerked away from him, startled. Her gaze penetrated his, and he couldn't help but think she reminded him of someone. Who, he couldn't be sure. No, mister. But thanks, I'm just looking." He nodded and picked up the toy truck. "The wheels move," he said. He wasn't sure why he didn't leave her alone, but something about her drew him, as if she was a delicate bird who had fallen and needed help. "I see that." Her response wasn't rude or arrogant. She reached out and picked up one of the trucks, a look of longing in her eyes. I bet little boys love to play with these. He found her statement strange and was about to reply when Jacob came up to her saying, "Come on, Liz, let's go." Abram watched the two of them leave, his heart hurting for the sadness the girl wore, as if it were a blanket around her shoulders. Samuel came toward him. "Sorry about that. Jacob is—" Samuel looked for the right word, and Abram supplied, "troubled?" Something like that. Samuel looked down at the little trucks. "Why do you spend time with him?" Abram asked before he could consider the effect of his words. "We were close friends once," Samuel said, carefully setting the truck back down. "He needs help, and I feel it my duty to give it. At least to do what I can." It was on the tip of Abram's tongue to ask what type of help the boy needed, but Samuel stepped back abruptly, as if realizing what he'd said. "I'd better get going. My mom asked me to come straight home tonight." Abram nodded and bid the boy goodbye. He watched him go, but his mind was elsewhere. It rested on the girl with the sad blue eyes and bright red hair. Rain pelted the window, and Sarah stifled a yawn as she went into Isaiah's room to make sure the window was closed. He cooed on the floor with the wooden toy Abram had brought home earlier in the week. It was a wooden block, sanded down so smoothly that it felt like fine silk under her fingers. She knew that Abram had made it especially for the boy, their son, and that he'd gone to extra care to make sure it was safe for him. She still couldn't believe that they had been allowed to keep the boy. Abram gently reminded her that they were still looking for his mother, but the fact that she hadn't come forward yet was a sign to Sarah. Or, at least she saw it as such. Sighing softly, she reached down and picked him up, taking the block and a blanket with her, down to the first floor. She needed to prepare dinner soon, but would let him play in the living room for a time while she worked on some mendings she had. The wind picked up, and she had the feeling that the storm would pick up that evening, if not sooner. The summer rains were good for crops, but they would make Abram's chores arduous. Her poor husband, he did so much. She smiled and watched as Isaiah pushed the block with his hands. He wouldn't crawl for months now, but she could tell he enjoyed the time he spent on his stomach. The wind shifted, and, as her gaze moved from the boy to the curtains flying open from the window she'd left cracked, she gasped. A face had appeared there for a moment, then was gone. It was almost as if it hadn't been there to begin with, but Sarah knew she had seen something. Checking to make sure Isaiah was safe and happy, she walked across the room to the window. It faced the pasture and the back of their property, but when she looked out, she didn't see anything. Had she imagined it? She closed her eyes and imagined what she thought she'd seen. To her dismay, It looked like the girl she had all but convinced herself didn't exist. But there she was again, peering through their window. The sound of horses' hooves drew her attention back to the front of the house, and she ducked to peer out of the window. At the beginning of their driveway, she saw Abram's buggy turn in. She sighed in thankfulness. She was ready to have him home. She had to tell Abram about the girl. He soon came inside, his shoulders drooping and his hat covered in rainwater. "Are you both well?" "Yes," she said, though she knew her tone betrayed her. "What is it, Leibchen?" he asked, immediately coming toward her. She explained what she'd seen, and his eyes narrowed. "Did you say red hair?" "Yes," she nodded, glancing down at Isaiah on the floor. Abram shook his head. "I have a feeling I know who it is." Her eyes widened. "You do?" As he explained about the girl he'd seen at the shop, her surprise mounted. What did this mean? Was it possible that she was the boy's mother? But what did she have to do with Jacob, and how was Samuel involved? Sarah sunk into the rocker, picking up Isaiah and cradling him. She had just gotten her own son. Would the Lord take him away from her so quickly? As if reading her thoughts, Abram rested a hand on her shoulder. "The Lord has a plan in all of this, Sarah." His gaze was reassuring, but she still wondered if it were the Lord's punishment from her past. But she couldn't get the words out. They wouldn't come. "Sarah," Abram said, sitting so he could look into her eyes, "what's wrong?" She knew he was asking about the look of pain that shot through her eyes at his words. The fear that welled up in her. She had kept her secret so long, she wasn't sure she could share it now. But the pressure to unburden her soul was too great. "Abram, I have something to tell you." "All right, I am listening." "I have held on to this truth about myself for too long. I must tell you." She swallowed, her hand absent-mindedly rubbing circles on the baby's back. "When I was younger, I was very rebellious. During my Rumspringer, I foolishly went to a bad part of town one night for a party. I got lost and was alone when suddenly I was attacked." The memories threatened to choke her. "I ran home and told no one, realizing I would never feel safe anywhere but back here. Back home. But then I found out that I was pregnant." Abram gasped and Sarah brushed tears from her cheek. "I was horrified. I knew it meant I couldn't go back to our way of life, not with a child. I was determined to do the right thing, but then one day I was overtaken by great pains. The friend I was staying with rushed me to the hospital where I found out I had lost the baby. I was heartbroken, but went home and was baptized. I met you a year later." The truth released, she sunk back against the chair, exhausted. "Don't you see? This is my fault. Gott is punishing me for my sin by taking Isaiah away." Abram moved suddenly to kneel before her, taking her free hand in his. "He's not. Leibchen, don't accuse him of that." She was stunned by his response. "You may have been rebellious, but it was not your fault you were attacked. Gott knew the name of your baby, and he had a reason for taking it home. Don't carry this weight on your shoulders. It was never yours to bear." His words opened the well of tears pressed down through the years. He gently took Isaiah from her and let her cry onto his shoulder until she calmed, gulping large breaths. "I wanted to tell you," she finally said, her voice muffled. "It's all right. I knew you had things from your past you wanted to avoid. I just wish you could have let me carry some of the burden." Sarah nodded, feeling more at peace. "What will we do about Isaiah?" "I will talk with Samuel tomorrow," Abram said. "We'll figure out what is going on." She nodded, knowing he was right. Closing her eyes, she lifted up a prayer of thanks. God would provide the answer. She was just afraid it would be the one she didn't want. Chapter 6. A Mother's Love. Abram walked to the shop the next day. It was farther than he liked to walk most days, but this morning he needed the time and the fresh air to think. Sarah's story had shocked him. He knew there was pain there, something she hadn't wanted to share, but he never could have guessed the extent of it. He lifted her up in prayer, begging the Lord to give her peace in the midst of all of this. To think that Gott had given them a son only to take him away frightened Abram. But he believed what he had told Sarah. God had a purpose in it all. The shop was cool and dark. The scent of tangy pine, his usual greeting. He breathed in deeply and set to work, keeping an eye outside. He had a plan, one he hadn't fully explained to Sarah in case it didn't work, but he prayed that it would. When Samuel came in, he kept the boy busy in the back of the shop with inventory and watched the road. Finally, just when he thought that the boy wouldn't show up, Jacob's car pulled up to the curb out front. The girl wasn't in the front seat this time, and Abram felt his stomach clench. Maybe his plan would fail, but he felt inner peace wash over him. No, this wasn't just his plan. It was God's plan. What needed to be accomplished would be. Abram could be certain of that. He pushed out the door and approached the bright red vehicle. The boy looked up, no doubt surprised to see Abram coming out instead of Samuel. Abram's eyebrows lifted when the boy got out of the car without being asked. "I've come to talk to you about the girl that's usually with you," Abram said. Jacob shuffled on his feet and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Yeah." Abram smiled to soften his words. "I think she has a son, and I think she's left her son in the care of my wife and me." Jacob's eyes widened. "How do you know it's hers?" "We don't," Abram said, his hands easily slipping into his pants pockets. "But my wife thinks she's seen the mother a few times. I have a feeling you know what this is about." "It's not what you think." "You don't know what I think, do you?" He kept his gaze level, tone even. "True." The boy looked down at his feet. "It's complicated." "Then unburden yourself, my boy. Tell me what's going on." Jacob's eyes rose to meet his, and Abram saw longing in them. There was still a desire, a need even, for this community. Abram could sense it. "I met Elizabeth Liz during my Rumspringer. I've fallen in love with her, but I'm torn. It's why I've been coming to talk to Samuel. He may be younger than I, but he is wise. I value his opinion. I want to marry her, but she has a son. She knows it was a mistake, he was hasty to add. She thought that maybe, if she gave him up to a good home, we could start a life together. But it's killing her to be without her son." Jacob looked out across the street, marks of pain clear on his face. Abram was beginning to see the whole scenario. The boy was likely making a decision not to be baptized into the community, but he wanted to do right by the girl. The painful truth washed over Abram in that moment. No matter how much he wanted a son, he couldn't accept this young woman's child as his own, not knowing she still wanted him, still loved him. He knew what they needed to do. Sarah sat on the porch, watching the storm clouds roll off in the distance. It didn't look as if they were going to come their way, but their large, billowy presence drew her gaze. They were powerful, containing life-giving rain, God's provision for the crops and the land. God always provided. Her soul resonated with the words even if she was having trouble feeling their truth. Isaiah slept in her arms after being up most of the night, crying for no particular reason. She vaguely wondered if he missed his mother, the familiar arms that he'd grown accustomed to, her voice, her scent. Sarah ached, knowing the truth. As much as she already loved the little boy in her arms, he wasn't her son. The council may have allowed them to keep the little boy, but it had always been with the understanding that they would give him back should the rightful parent be found. But had they done that? Fear gripped Sarah's chest at the thought of the red-haired girl. She cried out, a sob aching in her chest. The sound startled Isaiah awake, and she rocked back and forth, comforting him with gentle words despite the tears running down her cheek. Just as he was falling asleep again, she heard a sound. A noise around the corner of the house. She remembered leaving a rake there from her gardening earlier in the day and wondered if it had fallen over. Rising to her feet slowly, so as not to disturb the child, she walked to the corner and peered around. Two bright blue eyes framed by fiery red hair looked back at her. "Oh," the girl said, stumbling backward and trying to get up in an effort to run away. "Wait!" Sarah cried out, an arm extended in the girl's direction. The girl stumbled again, tripping over a clod of dirt and turning her back. She was ready to run, but Sarah knew she needed to stop her. "He's your son," Sarah said. The girl froze, stumbling to a halt. Her shoulders heaved up and down with the effort of her escape. Both women waited, the only sound the song of the birds. Until the girl finally turned around, tears streaming down her face, cheeks red. "And you left him with us," Sarah finished. The girl nodded once. "But I don't think you did it because you don't love him. I think you're scared. You didn't know what to do." The girl nodded again. "Why don't you sit down and we'll talk? Your son wants to be in your arms again, I'd say." The girl bit her lip, then slowly came towards Sarah, joining her on the porch. "What's your name, dear?" Sarah asked. She wasn't sure if the girl would answer, but she prayed for the Lord to open her heart and her lips. "Elizabeth, Liz," she finally said, her eyes never leaving Isaiah in Sarah's arms. "Do you want to hold him?" Yes. Sarah handed over the child, immediately feeling the lack of warmth from his small form. "Let's sit." They did, and Sarah prayed for direction for her words. "Tell me what happened." The girl waited so long Sarah wasn't sure she would answer, but finally she looked up from the boy, her eyes filled with sadness. She told a tale that was similar to Sarah's own past, so much so it brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but ended by mentioning Jacob Yoder. "He loves me and the baby," she said, her hand tracing a light line across the baby's face. "He wants to marry me, but I thought it would bring too much shame on him if he married a girl who had a baby. I thought, I've seen your husband at the woodshop with Samuel, and he was so kind. I watched and could see you both love one another. I thought, hoped he would have a good home with you." Sarah's heart clenched. She wanted to shout out that he did have a good home with them. But in that moment, she knew the truth. She couldn't selfishly take this young woman's baby from her. It wasn't right. It wasn't what God would want. Instead, she said, "Elizabeth, God does things in strange ways we cannot understand. Abram and I have prayed for a son for many years, but never had one. When we saw Isaiah, that is what we call him. We thought he was God's answer to our prayers. But sometimes we see only in part where he sees the whole." Elizabeth looked back down at the baby, nodding slowly. "I think we both know that Abram and I cannot keep the boy." Chapter 7. Closer. Abram rushed home, filled with anxiety and purpose. The emotions roared inside of him, but he tried to cling to the peace he'd felt. After talking with the council members again, they had come up with a plan to help Jacob and Elizabeth. Abram felt at peace with that decision, but the anxiety came from thinking about how Sarah would take the news. How could he tell his wife that she had to give up the baby? It would crush her. He made his way up the gravel path and around the side of the house, pausing when he heard voices. 2 women talking and laughing. He frowned, wondering if a neighbor was visiting. That would complicate things. Coming around the corner, he nearly fell over in astonishment. There, sitting on the porch with his wife, sat Elizabeth, her child in her arms. "Abram," Sarah said, the smile on her face both content and settled. "You're home?" He looked at Elizabeth, then back at Sarah. "I am. And we have a guest. This is Elizabeth, the mother of Isaiah." Abram came up onto the porch, unsure of how to proceed. Now there's much to discuss," Sarah said. He nodded. "There is. I've just come from a conversation with Jacob Yoder and the council." He eyed Elizabeth. Her face had gone pale at his mention of Jacob. "Then Herr Gott has been at work," Sarah said, smiling. The fact that she was smiling was complete evidence of the Lord's work. "Sit and tell us what has been decided." Still shocked and blinking away his surprise, he pulled up a chair and talked about their plans to help Jacob and Elizabeth. They would, of course, be required to marry, but the council had suggested that Abram and Sarah spend time with the couple individually, helping to teach them how to function as adults and one day loving parents. It was unorthodox, but the Lord's compassion toward others was compelling, and Abram had advocated that Sarah would be a good teacher for Elizabeth should the girl agree. When he was done, his eyes came to rest on the young woman. "What do you say, Elizabeth?" Her sad smile turned toward the baby in her lap. "It's more than I could have hoped for," she finally said. "You will make a good mother," Sarah added. "You can stay with us for as long as you like. We will help you." Abram nodded, loving the compassionate nature of his wife and her heart for helping others. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "And one more thing." Abram's stomach squeezed, wondering what she would say. "I like to call him Isaiah still," she said, her cheeks turning pink. "If that's all right?" Abram looked to Sarah and was pleased to see her satisfied smile. "That is quite all right," she said. Sarah slipped into bed beside Abram, the weight of the day sliding off her more quickly than she would have expected. Nothing about this day had gone as planned, and yet she still had a feeling of complete and utter peace in her heart. She had lost a son, and yet gained a sweet friend in his mother. Though Elizabeth was young and not a member of their community, the thought of showing her kindness and guiding her along her path to being a mother invigorated Sarah. Abram picked up her hand in his work, worn ones. "What is on your mind, Freya?" "So many things, Abram." "Tell me, unburden yourself." She smiled at his kindness. "I cannot help but wonder at her Gott's plan. It isn't something I would have chosen, to gain and then lose a son, but I find that I feel purpose through it all." Abram nodded. "He works in wondrous and mysterious ways. It's not what I would have chosen either, but he will be faithful to help us, to see us through. I hope you don't mind that I invited her to stay with us." "No," Abram said, smiling. "I thought you would, and I expected that. You have a big, kind heart, and one that seeks to help others. We have a large house and the space. It will be good for her to be with her child, but with you, to learn." Sarah nodded. "I agree." She sat in silence, thoughts swirling around in her head. She still desired a baby, but the feelings were different now, not so all-encompassing. It was easier to see past her own desires to see the will of God more clearly. He had called Sarah and Abram into a place of teaching. Something they wouldn't have stepped into on their own, but something they were both equipped for. It was glorious, strange, and exciting. "It's strange," Sarah finally said. "In a way, we do have children." Abram's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They are not of our flesh and blood, but Jacob and Elizabeth need the instruction of good parents, of those older than them. They need to learn what it means to be a good mother or a strong man, and here God has placed us in that role for them, adopted parents." The smile that spread over Abram's face was infectious, and Sarah's matched it. "How did I marry such a smart wife?" She grinned, blushing from his comment as much as his intent gaze. "I don't know." He reached up, cupping her face with his hand. "I don't either, but there is one thing that I do know." "What is that, my love?" Her heart beat rapidly, the touch of her husband warm and soft on her skin. "That I am blessed by you," he smiled, lowering his lips to hers. "Your love and service to me, and Herr Gott is unmatched, in my opinion. You make me the happiest man in the world." Despite the loss of Isaiah, Sarah felt as if she had gained something else, an additional closeness with her husband. Their love was a gift she would never understand, but would always be thankful for. Chapter 8, a perfect gift. 6 months later, Abram and Sarah watched as Elizabeth and Jacob drove off, baby Isaiah in his carrier, in the back seat. After their wedding 2 weeks ago, they had made it a point to come and visit Abram and Sarah for a night, to share about the day and for the couple to see the boy again. Sarah sighed, her shoulders shaking slightly. He looked down to see tears in her eyes. He had known it would be hard for her, to see them leave with the child who had been like a son to them. He wanted nothing more than to take away the pain that she felt. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his grip around her shoulders tightening. "Sorry," she said, looking up at him and wiping beneath her eyes. "For the hurt you feel." Her face transformed before him, assuming a delicate smile. It radiated through her eyes, still glistening with tears. "You mistake my tears, my love. These are tears of happiness." He frowned. "They are?" "Yes." She turned to face him, clasping his hands. "I will miss them, especially baby Isaiah, but I know that they are moving on to their own life, as we will move on with ours." He smiled down at her, his eyes searching her light brown ones that glowed in the cloudy afternoon light. "My beautiful wife, you always surprise me." "And I have one more surprise for you," she said, her grin growing wider. "What is that? You have already given me your love, your time, and your service in our home. I couldn't ask for anything else from you, nor would I want to." She laughed, squeezing his hands. "I know you would not ask anything of me, but yet her God has seen to provide us with something we've both asked for." Abram's thoughts tripped on her words. What was she saying? In his silence, she continued, "I did not ever think this day would come, and yet it has." She took in a deep breath and leaned toward him. "I am expecting a child." He gaped at her, the words not fully sinking into his mind. "A child?" "Yes, Abram, our own child." She released one of his hands and rested hers on her abdomen. Abram couldn't help it. He laughed out loud, pulling her toward him in a hug. "Can it be? Has the Lord blessed us in our old age?" "Yes," she said, her words muffled against him. I believe it will be a son." He pulled back, their eyes meeting. "You cannot know," he reminded her. "No, but if it is a boy, I ask that we name him Isaac." Abram nodded, knowing that the name fit perfectly. "I agree." They embraced again, still laughing. Abram felt the reality that the Lord knew what was best in every situation. He would continue to provide for them as he always had, and they would continue to reap his blessings as much as feel his presence through the difficult times. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.